trying to please you. Just get started. Girl, why you leaving? Why you gonna help yourself? I'll be breaking up again.
I have wanted to make one of these vests for so long, and finally today I'm bringing it to life. My Pinterest is full of these beautiful quilted / padded vests with the tie feature at the front. I have the most beautiful thrifted material that I thought would be perfect to be a cute statement external vest that I can layer up. So that's what I'm going to make today. If you happen to want to follow along, keep watching, and this is what you'll need. So if you're going to make this double-sided, you will need 2 lots of material, 1 for each side, as well as some bias binding. Now the material comes down to obviously the climate that you'll be wearing this in, your style, all that. Personally, I was going to make this one nice and warm. First up, for the bias binding, I wanted to make it contrasting, so I actually ended up going with 2 different colors that you'll see at the end, just because the first color was my priority. I ended up running out of that, and then I utilized what I had laying around, which is this more beige looking one. And the size of mine, when you unfold it, it is flat. It is about 3/4 of an inch or 2.5 centimeters wide. Then for the material, both of these are secondhand pieces of material. This first floral one, I think it's like a vintage tablecloth or curtain. It has the feeling of kind of like a cotton linen blend, so it's nice and lightweight and breathable and will be nice and easy to sew. Whereas the second material that I'm using is a wool blanket. As you can tell, I'm planning to wear this on more of a colder climate, and the wool will be great to obviously keep me warm. The benefit of this being double-sided as well is you can go with like 2 completely different colors, patterns, so you've literally got 2 whole different garments in one. Or for this, I kind of went a similar theme of like the warm autumn tones. For the amount of material, I will put that in the description of this video, so check that out if you're wanting to make this yourself. And then if you are like me and wanting to make this a warm vest, then you'll need to get some padding or filler. Or for this, I'm actually using a mattress cover that was laying around and we didn't really end up using, so it's pretty much brand new, but I thought I would just actually give it a second life. Otherwise, you can see on the inside of this mattress topper, it has got a synthetic fill, and I believe when you go to like a fabric store or a craft store, that is what you'll end up seeing, is just that fill on its own. And then once you've got those essentials, you'll just need the usual suspects of a DIY project, which is your measuring tape, some fabric scissors, some matching thread to your bias binding, as this will be the only areas that you'll see the stitch on the outside. And then you'll need some pins and some paper to draw out your pattern, along with some paper scissors and a pencil to trace out. And then lastly, you'll need a reference top to draw around, as we'll be doing a self-drafting process to bring this to life. I would suggest it being a little bit oversized, the top that you trace around, just because this is going to be an outer layer, so you probably will be wearing it on top of things. I think I've mainly based my pattern off of this singlet style, meaning it pretty much sits exactly where I want it to. Whereas if you don't have anything that is like the exact shape of the vest that you'll be creating, I'll show you how to base this pattern off a regular top. Again, just make sure it is at least a little bit oversized or loose fitting. Before we jump into bringing this vest to life, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to the sponsor of today's video, which is Adobe Photoshop. And in particular, I wanted to share Photoshop's latest generative AI features. Whenever it comes to creating thumbnails for my tutorials, I always find myself stumped with choosing the perfect image, as majority of them are taken vertically for other platforms, so they don't quite translate to the horizontal setup I need for YouTube. But with the help of the new Adobe AI integration, I no longer need to worry about this. Here's an example where I have a few options of images, which include the vest from my latest sewing tutorial, taken back in Paris, but unfortunately they're cropped, and being back in Australia, it's not something I can easily recreate in person. Normally I'd have to do some collage situation to make it work. Now I can easily create one wider image just by simply expanding the size of the artboard, selecting generative expand, and then helping it with some prompt words to fit the vibe of the scene. Then choose between the multiple options which are provided. If I tried to do this on my own, it'd probably take me hours of fiddling around, and that's just not a smart use of my time, to be honest. This generative fill option also comes in handy for changing up backgrounds entirely, as well as selectively removing and replacing people or objects you don't want to be included. I've personally been using the Adobe suite for over 10 years now, and I love that these new Photoshop features will continue to help me to save time on tasks that used to be quite tedious, so I can focus back on what I want to be doing, which is the actual creation of my DIY garments. Speaking of, let's get back into the sewing. For the front pattern piece, we'll just fold the top that we're referencing in half, and with the front facing upwards, and then tuck away any areas to better reflect the style that we'll be creating. So this might mean tucking up the bottom so it reaches the length that you want it to be. This could involve grabbing your measuring tape and measuring from your shoulders down to where you would like it to be, and then double checking this on the amount that you fold up. I wanted mine to finish around my waist area, as I'll be wearing it probably with high-waisted stuff, whereas I do eventually want to make a longer version of this and go kind of like down to my hips. So just keep in mind how you would personally like this this to look, and fold it up to that length. Then from the neckline, again, you can grab your measuring tape and measure down to where you would like the front dipping V of the vest to finish. I personally wanted this to be quite low just because, again, I'm going to be layering it with stuff. I've seen some styles that have it quite high. If that's your preference and the look you're going for, you can definitely do that. Or you can have it mid chest, low chest, whatever you prefer. Figure that out and then fold the top back to that section. I do find with the regular top that the shoulder area is quite wide because generally a top finishes past the edge of your shoulder and hangs over the arm a little bit. As well, this was quite a crew neck style, so it came up quite tight to my neck, and I don't want the vest to do that. So I made sure to fold back the neck area, which for me was about 2 centimeters or just under an inch. Again, like I just mentioned, the shoulder section goes out quite wide, so for me I ended up folding about 3 to 4 centimeters of that area, just so it would help the vest sit more on top of my shoulders rather than hanging off the edge. So once you're happy with how that is all looking, we will then just trace around this area. I'm just going to trace exactly where this is, so when I go to cut it out, I remember to add seam allowance. As I'm tracing around this neckline, I tend to just curve into the center straight section. This will just come in handy later when we add the bias binding on, having less pointy edges to go around. If it makes it any easier, you can draw out the pointy edges to start and then just curve them out once you've removed the top, and then you're ready to cut it. Another point that we can curve out and make our life a lot easier is the bottom corner of the center section. I just freehanded this corner, otherwise you can grab a cup or a compass or something that will help you go around this corner more equally. Then that means you should only have straight or curved edges to go around with the bias binding when you add that in the end, and I personally find that much easier. So once we've traced around that and we're happy with how it's looking, we'll then cut it out, and that means we've got the front pattern all done. We'll use this for both the left and right side of the pattern, just meaning that when we cut it out on the fabric, we'll need to remember to mirror the pattern on there. I like to use this front piece as a template to create the back piece pattern, as I like the shoulders to be the same width and I can adjust anything from there. So lay down this cutout piece on your spare bit of paper and we'll begin tracing around the shoulder. As I want it to be nice and snug at the back neck area, I just create a curved dip down by about 1 inch from in line with that shoulder area, and it will finish in line with that back center area. Essentially, I just keep the rest of it all the same, making sure instead just to go straight down those back center areas where the curve is on the front. If you need a reminder that this is going to be cut on the fold, you can write a little on the fold note, and that just means that when you go to cut it out, this is meant to be a wider one-piece panel. And now that we have the pattern pieces, it is time to utilize them to cut out the fabric panels. When it comes to tracing around the pattern, like I mentioned earlier, I didn't add any seam allowance to it. So we'll be adding 1 centimeter or just under ½ an inch of seam allowance to the shoulder edges, as well as the side edges below the armhole, which you can see in this graphic, and feel free to screenshot it if you need to come back and reference it. And then I won't need to add any seam allowance to the rest of the edges because they will either be finished with bias binding or on the fold. Now this comes down to how many layers you're creating. You might just be doing maybe 2 reversible pieces of fabric, otherwise you might be like me and doing 3 layers where you have the 2 reversible pieces of fabric as well as the padding inside for warmth. Once you've mapped that all out, we'll then trace around the pattern pieces. You'll end up needing to cut out 2 front pieces. Just keep in mind that these need to be mirrored. Essentially just make sure that you have them good side facing when you cut it out, and that means when you unfold them they'll be mirroring pieces. And then to cut out the back piece, like I mentioned earlier, we cut the pattern piece on the fold. So there's 2 ways you can go about this. You can literally fold the bit of material and then align the folded edge of the pattern to the folded edge of the material and cut it all out in one go. Otherwise for this I just laid out half of my panel, made sure I had enough material where it can flip over and create a second half of this, traced around it, again keeping in mind all the seam allowances in the shoulder and the side edge, and then just folded it in that center section so the good sides are facing. That ends up creating a mirrored second half, and then just cut around this second half, and that means when I unfold it I'll have one entire back piece. Then I just need to repeat this cutting process of the 2 front pieces and the 1 back piece for the rest of the layers, including the padding and the checkered blanket side. Now the fabric panels are all cut out, it's time to start assembling them. I'm actually going to sneak in one extra step where I attach the padding onto one of the layers, just because I feel like when it comes to the next step of actually joining it all, it'll just mean there's less movement that you have to worry about, as it will be attached, and essentially you can just look at it as one piece of material. So I attached the padding onto the wool blanket side, and I just did this by lining it up, making sure that the padding is on the bad side or the inside of the material if you particularly have a good or bad side, and then sewed one continuous line around the entire perimeter of each of these pieces, including the back and the 2 front, ideally making sure to sew as close to the edge as possible. For me that was about ½ a centimeter off the edge. Now it's time to focus on joining the seams, so we'll focus on joining the matching materials. I'm going to start on my floral material. I'll lay the front front panel on the back panel, making sure that they are good sides facing and the shoulder is matching and the side seam is all matching. You can pin this in place so that it doesn't move around if you prefer, and I'll do it for the second side as well. And the two areas we'll be sewing is along the top shoulder and down those side seams under the armhole. Again, just making sure you're about 1 centimeter or just under half an inch off these edges for the seamlets that we allowed. Once you've done one layer, you can then switch focus to the second layer. For me, this means I have the padding and my checkered material joined, and as I mentioned earlier, just going to look at them as one piece of material. Again, we'll lay them good sides facing and then sew along the shoulder edges and down the side seams. So where I'm at now is I have joined the padding and wool blanket side together. It has created one vest like this, and then I've got my linen cotton blend vest, and essentially the goal is to then add this one over the top so that the padding is sandwiched in the middle. You've got the good side of this material and then the good side of that material facing outwards. I'm going to do one line around all the joining areas, which will be the neckline, front line, and then down the center bottom section, as well as the armholes, and I can make any adjustments if need be. If for some reason they're not matching up, I can either trim it down and just add this line in, which will help fix it all together again, or maybe it involves taking in bits again from here. So far it seems to be working. And then once I've got it all matched up, then I'll add the bias binding. One thing I am noticing is that these armholes are quite up there. It's not the worst, seeming as I'm probably going to be wearing this when it's cold and it keeps me all nice and warm, but it just does feel a little bit cramped up there. So I'll do the one sewing line and maybe trim a little bit out of the armhole down the bottom just to open it up a little bit. The whole point is I'll probably be layering this with stuff. So it could be like a big puffy sleeve or like a thicker button-up shirt or something underneath. So I'd rather have the ability to do that than have it too tight and then it be limited. See you on the other side. We'll now start to go around and join the two layers together, making sure that the good materials are all facing outwards so it has that final reversible effect that we're aiming for. I'd suggest lining it up at key areas, so I started around the shoulder seam, pinned this in place, matched the other shoulder seams, and continued pinning around all of the raw edges, making sure that they are all aligned and prepped to start sewing. I must admit the wool and the padding has made some very, very thick areas, so once I sew around some of these seams, I'm just going to have to be very careful. I'm probably going to sew about 1.5 centimeters from the bottom of that seam and kind of ease up to the existing top bit. I feel like that will just help open that up just by that little bit that I need. A tip, if you haven't sewn much with thick stuff, is I tend to just get to the point where it's thick and then maybe use the hand swivel and go over it really slowly, so I don't put my foot down on the foot pedal, just do it manually until I get past it, and then hopefully that should help prevent the needle from stretching, and then I just get back to normal when I'm on the other side. Let's see how that goes. And I just kind of use this hand to like push or pull the fabric through because it might get a bit jammed. Cute! Okay, let's see if I can replicate that little bit down from the other side. There's one thing about armholes. I do find a lot of the times I'll like draw out what I think will be good based on something else, and then I go to try it on and it like sits weird here or it needs to be lower, so it's totally fine for something to not be perfect the first time around and to need to adjust as you go. If possible, try sew as close as you can to the edge. Again, I aimed for about 0.5 centimeter, just because this final line, we want it to get hidden within the bias binding, so the closer to the edge, the better. Like I just mentioned, I'm going to sew just a little bit lower at the base of the armholes, and that means that I can open them up a little bit and trim it down to that point. And then apart from that, I'll just go around the whole edge of the bottom, the front area, the neckline, back down the other front side, and along the back to where I started. So adding the bias binding is going to be the final step that helps it all come together and feel like it is all one complete piece. And how we do that is grab your bias binding, lay it down so the good sides of the bias binding are facing the good side of the material. You can pick whatever side you add this onto at first because it should generally look the same on both sides once we complete this. Then unfold the folded line so the raw edge of the bias binding is matching the raw edge of the garment, and we'll be sewing along that crease line of the fold the entire way from the base of the center back, all along the front edge, along the neckline, back down the other front edge, and along the back to where we started. Make sure when you start attaching the bias binding that you leave a little tail end at the beginning. I would recommend about 1 to 2 inches, just as we'll need that as a little bit of extra material at the end to join it all up. Keep that in mind. Don't just start sewing at the very beginning. If you haven't already, switch your thread to a matching color that suits the color of the bias binding, and then we'll begin the process of sewing around this entire edge where we'll be securing the bias binding onto the garment. This is a good point to make sure that you are sewing on the outside of the existing sewing line on the garment. I mean, worst comes to worst, you can unpick it if it does appear, but ideally you want to sew where the existing sewing line will sit on the seam allowance of the bias binding. So once you get back to pretty much close to where you started, I'd recommend stop sewing about 2 inches away from there, and that way we can match up the tail end of the beginning with the extra material at the end to close it up and make it a nice clean finish of the bias binding so you can't really see where it begins or finishes. To do this, just align the bias binding so it is good sides facing. Figure out the point where you will sew the line to create a nice snug finish so that the bias binding sits nice and flat. You can mark this out with some fabric chalk if that makes it nice and easier. Otherwise, line it up and then jump over to your sewing machine. Sew this bias binding so all the folded edges are laying flat, the bias binding is good sides facing, and sew along your marked area where it will create the clean finished bias. And then you'll notice we still have that last gap remaining, so we'll jump back on the sewing machine and do a final sewing line along the crease of that fold, and that means the first stage of the bias binding is all complete. For the second part, we need to now fold the bias binding so it is sitting on the bottom side or the other side of the material, and it wraps around these raw edges so they are hidden completely in the inside of the bias binding. Just keep in mind as you are folding this edge of the bias binding to the opposite side, we're keeping this part folded as it will keep that edge nice and clean. Also, if possible, try and fold it so that you have the same amount showing on this side that you do on the other side. When you're happy with where it's all sitting, you can then pin it all in place, jump on the machine, start sewing at the center back area entirely around this edge so that you are adding the final sewing line to secure this bias binding in place. Make sure that you are sewing in line with where the bias binding is on the underside as well. So then because we have matched the thread to the bias binding, it will just blend in and you won't see the sewing line. Whereas if you accidentally start to veer maybe to the edge and onto the material, you're going to see the line of the sewing, which isn't the end of the world, but I think just for a final consideration and detail, it looks nice when the sewing line remains on the bias binding. And then we are officially down to the final step. So to create the final strap, I ended up just utilizing the bias binding as I wanted it to be all similar looking. Because the bias binding has folded edges anyway, I folded the bias binding so it's good sides facing and then sewed across the short edge, just so that means that the end of it is nice and clean, and then I flipped it good sides facing out. I then trimmed off any excess seam allowance as close as I could to the sewing line, and then flipped it good sides facing out. And then because the edges of the bias binding are folded anyway, I'm just going to utilize this feature and just sew entirely down the length of this bias binding while the good edges are all facing outwards, and that means my straps are all complete. Again, this comes down to personal preference, how long you would like your strap to be. I was happy to cut mine at about 30 centimeters or 12 inches, and then I just repeated that for a second piece, and that means I had the 2 front tie pieces ready to attach. This might be a good time to throw on the vest and just double check where you would like it to tie. For me, mine pretty much sits in line with my bust area just because I personally feel like that is a nice point for it to flow out from. Mark out where you would like it to be, and then pick out a side that you would like to attach the strap onto. Lay down the raw edge of the strap so that majority of the strap is laying on the garment, and the raw edge of the strap is essentially aligned to the edge of the bias binding. Offset it slightly from the edge just so no raw material will be hanging out. Worst comes to worst, you can trim this down later, but it's just nice to have it looking how you want it to at the beginning. Then we're going to secure this strap by sewing in line with the existing sewing line of the bias binding. So that was about maybe just under a centimeter off the edge, and that way the new line of attaching this strap will just blend in with the existing line of the bias binding. Then once you've got that first line in, we will then fold the strap outwards so it's facing the direction that we want it to sit at the end so we can tie it up, and then we'll do a second and final sewing line as close to the edge of the bias binding so it's securing the strap in place as well as hiding that raw edge that we have within there. After watching this back, I realized this probably isn't the best angle to film it, so apologies about that. And then for the second strap, obviously just make sure it is in line with the first strap, and that means the garment is all done. Oh my god, this has been in my mind for so long. It came to life exactly how I wanted it. I can't wait to make it in so many different patterns and materials and different seasons. It definitely got a good workout while we were over in Europe with the ability to keep my chest nice and warm. But now I feel like I need a nice like summery linen one that I can wear around home. Anyway, I loved bringing this tutorial to life and sharing it with you guys. Hope it all made sense. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, or let me know below. Also tag me at the Essentials Club if you also give it a go. I love seeing your outcomes. And I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are. I'll see you in the upcoming videos.